Good evening, everyone. I'm Erin Burnett. Out front tonight, it's the economy, stupid. In a surprise news conference today, the president blamed Congress for keeping Americans out of work.
They left most of the jobs plan just sitting there. And in light of the headwinds that we're facing right now, I urge them to reconsider. Because there are steps we can take right now to put more people back to work.
The president is angry that Congress has not passed his jobs bill, which has sat on the shelf since last fall. Now, part of it did pass, the payroll tax cut extension and long-term unemployment insurance. But the president wants to pass the rest immediately. And the price tag is $297 billion. His bill summary, which we obtained from the White House, says that money will go to things like preventing teacher layoffs, modernizing schools, building science labs, for a total of $297 billion. But does spending more add up? We really wanted to know the answer to that question. And so we did the math on how much money American taxpayers have spent on stimulus since the crisis began. And obviously it began in 2008 under George W. Bush. So the first stimulus bill, this was President Obama's in the spring of 2009, $831 billion. Unemployment benefit extensions that have been passed since that time, $185 billion. The payroll tax cut extension, $93 billion. $69 billion in TARP money that has not been paid back. Plus, there's Ben Bernanke's tab, $2.3 trillion in efforts to keep interest rates low. As you can see, we had to actually swip the screen here because there were so many numbers. Then, if you add in the $297 billion, the cost of the jobs bill, the grand total would be $3.8 trillion. $3.8 trillion. That is a stunning and shocking number. And here we are, almost 4 years exactly after the financial crisis began. And according to research firm BTIG, America still has 735,000 fewer jobs than at the peak in 2007. And of course, that's just an absolute number. There are more people who are at working age now, so the hole is significantly bigger than that. So will borrowing more money now turn it around? Or is this a case of diminishing returns? 100 billion, 200 billion, 300 billion. All of a sudden, you're talking 3.8 trillion. Throwing more money at a problem may or may not help fix it. Out front tonight is Robert Reich, former Clinton Labor Secretary and author of Beyond Outrage, and Dan Mitchell, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Dan, I want to make it clear here that obviously, given the timing of the financial crisis, most of that money was spent under Barack Obama, but George Bush started it with the TARP plan, and even before the crisis began, he had done a stimulus plan earlier that year. This is a bipartisan stimulus spending environment, and I'm just wondering whether you think it's worth spending any more.
I agree with you completely. Bush was a big spender, interventionist. Obama's been a big spender, interventionist. But it's not a question of, as you described it, diminishing returns. It's negative returns. Keynesian economics didn't work for Hoover and Roosevelt in the 30s. It didn't work for Japan in the 90s. It hasn't worked for Bush and Obama. We need to make governments smaller, not bigger. We should copy countries like Singapore and Hong Kong and Estonia and Switzerland that have managed to keep government spending under control. More resources in the productive sector of the economy. That's the key to long-run sustainable growth.
Bob Reich, I mean, should we be spending more right now? I mean, even if you were in the camp that wanted a lot more money earlier, if you didn't get it, does it make sense now to put a few hundred billion here, a few hundred billion there? Or is that piecemeal way just not going to do it?
Well, Erin, as long as the private sector continues to hold back in terms of hiring, in terms of utilizing its resources, as long as we continue to have very high unemployment, the question is, where is the boost going to come from? Where's the growth going to come from? And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon your point of view, we only have one force left to actually boost the economy, and that's called government. Over the long term, Dan is absolutely right. We've got to get government spending under control over the long term. But just like we coming out of the Great Depression, we had World War II, which was a massive government program. I'm certainly not advocating anything like that, but that got us out of the Depression. When you have that much underutilized capacity, that much unemployment, you've got to have spending.
But spending on what? I mean, now you've got this concern about $15.6 trillion in debt and rising, Robert. I mean, you spend more money, the private sector goes, oh my gosh, I'm so worried about indebtedness in this country, and they might batten down the hatches even more as opposed to opening them up.
Well, Aaron, I think that ultimately the choice comes down to whether you embrace the philosophy, the dominant philosophy in Europe right now, which has been you cut budgets right now, even though you have high unemployment and a lot of capacity that's not being used. That has got things worse in Europe. That means a deeper recession. That means fewer people working. That means less revenues into government.
Right.
Or whether you embrace, I don't care whether you call it Keynesianism or you call it cottage cheese, it doesn't matter, whether you embrace the notion that if the boost is not going to come from the private sector, at least immediately in the short term, it's got to come from government. And what I think the president is saying, and what he said today was, Congress, I'm not asking for the moon, I'm asking for some common sense, targeted things that we need to do with regard to the mortgage crisis, which goes on, with regard to providing tax breaks for businesses that hire people, and with regard to simply creating an environment that is more conducive because of enough stimulus in the economy to get things going.
But Dan, I mean, specifically, I mean, you can go through any one of these stimulus packages, Democrat or Republican, and make fun of all sorts of the specific line items and laugh at them. But there is a serious point that Robert's making, right? I mean, when you look at the gap that we have in this country, you know, there are estimates, very rational ones, that 35 to 45% of our budget gap is because of revenue. You know, so if you get more people working, you get more revenue. So that might make the argument for stimulus to get those people working and get the revenue.
But the question is, what gives you so-called stimulus? And I don't think the government borrowing a bunch of money out of the private sector, spending it on a bunch of cronies of the administration, is a recipe for growth. Now, Robert talked about Europe, and I think Europe is very instructive because there's a giant difference between what I call public sector austerity and private sector austerity. In countries like France and England and Greece and Italy, they're raising taxes. They're squeezing the private sector for their quote-unquote austerity. I look at the countries in the Baltics, Estonia especially. They cut government spending, and not just the make-believe way we cut spending in Washington, where you don't increase it as fast as you previously planned. In Estonia in 2009 and 2010, government was actually smaller. They're now growing. They're a big feature in the news about how they're prospering, even though they have the euro, just like Greece. So I think the lesson from Europe is high taxes. That's the wrong kind of austerity. Less government spending. That is the recipe for freeing up resources for the productive sector of the economy.
All right. Well, thanks to both of you. I only have to hit pause there, but please, everyone, we'll have them back.